I don't know if you've noticed, but the world is breaking. And it's not an accident. It's a plan. Or rather, a puzzle. And I prefer to call it a puzzle because I think there's a solution. And I think I may have figured it out. I can't be entirely sure that I'm actually there yet, but that's why I need you. See, I can't be sure where my bias ends and the real solution begins, so I have to expose my ideas to criticism, right? And if I'm right, it's a kind of a big deal, so I guess I'm obligated to share. I'm not a media person or a public speaker, but what I am is a code breaker, or a thinker. There's a bit of a problem here, though, because I could actually describe to you the solution as I see it in just a handful of sentences, but you wouldn't understand it. And if for no other reason, then you just don't have the proper context. Language has been mutilated to the point where when I say a word, you're likely to hear something other than what I mean. So naturally, the first step would be to give you a key to the map, so to speak, and clearly define things. Make sure you know how I'm using these words. So I guess the first thing I need to clearly define is the problem itself. What is the problem? In my view, the problem is a crisis of reality. People have no idea what to believe and what not to believe anymore. It's difficult to discern what is fact from what is fiction, especially when you take into account AI and fake news, political motivations, for example, to distort truth. And as time goes on, things get more convoluted and less easy to discern, let's say. So the problem, fundamentally, is psychological. So what can you know for sure? Let's start there. Well, you know that you are a thinker thinking thoughts, so therefore you exist. You exist. I might not exist. I might be AI. But you know you exist. The conscious acknowledgement of yourself as a thinker thinking thoughts is called metacognition, self-awareness, self-analysis. Epistemology is what we're doing right now. It's a systematic analysis of what we know and what we don't know. What can we know? Logic, in one sense, is the operational rules of a system, in this case, reality, that allow for continuity or the progression of events and distinctions, categorical distinctions between one thing and another. So we can be sure that reality is ultimately logical because you woke up this morning and a series of events followed and you were distinct from your hairdryer. Our physical senses provide limited and often deceptive information regarding what is real. We don't actually ever observe a thing as it truly is. True understanding comes from systematic analysis. As Sherlock Holmes says, we have to eliminate the impossible, and what we're left with is the truth. And we do this by identifying what couldn't possibly be true based on the laws of nature as we understand them. And this is called a logical fallacy. A good example fallacy to start with is affirming the consequent. And the classic example of affirming the consequent is you're looking out your window and you see that the ground is wet, so you say, therefore, it must have rained. And then you get closer to your window and you realize that the neighbor was washing his car and that's why the ground's wet. But you stopped the reasoning process at a place where you were incorrect. Even if it did rain, the reasoning is still wrong. And following these lines of reasoning is guaranteed to lead you to false conclusions. Now, if you construct a fallacy and I call you out for it, there's nothing inherently forcing you to acknowledge that. Even if on some level you know that you've made a fallacy, you can still just deny it, right? And if you see it as a blow to your ego, you probably will. So good faith is operating as though you're trying to figure out what is real and not just trying to win the argument. You have to try to understand what your interlocutor is saying, and that means coming up with the best interpretation of what they mean by their words. The interpretation that makes it make sense. You got to argue from within their narrative, right? In order to give it a fair shake. That's called steelman. You have to steelman their position, and that's in opposition to a straw man, which is what somebody does when they're trying to protect their ego, which is misrepresent somebody's argument to make it weaker, and then argue against that. The reason people tend to make these sorts of arguments is because you have three brain systems, and only one of those brain systems operates in a self-aware manner. There's two brain systems that operate independently of the conscious mind, and only produce effects that keep you alive, and can manifest in the conscious mind almost as conscious thoughts or subconscious thoughts that you interpret as conscious thoughts. And protecting one's ego is a survival instinct that comes from these lower brain systems. And the brain is also separated into two hemispheres and two systems of thinking. Not entirely attributable to the hemispheres themselves, but there is a correlation there. But I'm talking about the left-right brain paradigm, where a part of your brain is capable of and responsible for conscious thought and self-awareness, self-analysis, logical thinking. And the other part of your brain is responsible for imagination and novelty. So in order for you to truly understand anything, you have to be persuaded either through your own reasoning faculties or through argumentation. Now, because of our instinctive biases, the parts of our brain that lead us to false conclusions, one can be persuaded of things that don't actually make any sense. And so people can use this intentionally or unintentionally, just out of habit, to win arguments even if they're not saying anything true, right? And this process protects people's egos, but reduces actual understanding or comprehension, awareness. So there's three primary modes of persuasion, and two of them are only persuasive because of instinctive biases. And one of them is persuasive because it reflects or attempts to reflect what is actually true. And true things are persuasive because they make sense. Ethos is the ultimate one, the appeal to authority, where someone's opinion isn't valid unless they have the authority to speak on the subject. And this is a logical fallacy. It doesn't tell you anything about what is true, and if you appeal to authority, you're likely to be misled, because the authority, if they know you're going to take for granted their dictates, they are incentivized to misrepresent for their own benefit, because you would believe it anyway. Ironically, this isn't necessarily the prevailing view, but I would call the bandwagon fallacy just an extension of the appeal to authority fallacy. It appeals to the authority of the group. It requires the same kind of thinking. A thing must be true because most people believe it's true. And we know historically that this is nonsensical. The majority of people tend to believe all kinds of silly things, so it doesn't tell you anything about reality. Pathos is when you appeal to somebody's emotions to try to sidestep their reasoning, and this is always manipulative. Regardless of how flowery or nice it sounds, usually it's disguised as something nice, but it's a way to sidestep the reasoning so that they don't have to be accountable for what they believe. And you can be emotional about things that are completely made up, not real, in your head, delusion. Reasoning is still required to inform you about what to be emotional about, right? What makes sense to even apply your emotions to. So you still have to provide reasoning. And that's why appeal to emotion is also a logical fallacy. Logos persuasion is appealing to the authority of reality itself and asking you to apply your emotions to things that make sense. And it requires the ability to admit when you're wrong. So the only fair and honest way to persuade somebody of something that doesn't violate their autonomy is logos argumentation. What you're saying has to make sense. Otherwise, you're attempting to violate their autonomy by manipulating them into something that doesn't necessarily have to be true. And it shows a lack of respect for the other person that they couldn't possibly know something that you haven't already thought of, right? That you are superior to them because it's a power play and it's unreasonable. So this was just a speed run of some of my axioms that I'm going to be taking for granted moving forward. This is the foundation for the entire rest of my argument. So it's going to be important. And I know this might be familiar to some people, but trust me, it's going to get juicier as we go, okay? So I hope I'll see you there.